Hello and welcome to another online lecture on game design. This time we'll be discussing feedback loops and how you can use them to shape the dynamics of your game. My name is Lars Kalthoff. I am a game designer and currently studying at the Cologne Game Lab. Here's a question for you. What do these things have in common? A thermostat regulating the temperature in your room, kill streaks in the popular first-person shooters Call of Duty, a stampede of animals like the one that kills Mufasa in The Lion King, the infamous blue shell in the Mario Kart series, and a line from the Bible, "For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away." Surprise, surprise, they all relate to the topic of this lecture. They are examples of feedback loops. And feedback loops play a role in many different fields like biology, engineering, and game design. But the concept was really formalized in cybernetics, a field that deals with the study of systems and their regulation. So we're going to look at the definition of cybernetic feedback loops first, before we apply that knowledge to game design. Basically, a feedback loop is a system where its own output determines the behavior of the system in the future. That sounds a bit complicated, so let's make it simple. If you have a basic system, first of all, there's something coming into the system from outside, so-called input, that controls how the system works. This could be actual objects that you put into a machine, but it could also just be the user defining what program to run. And based on that input, the system produces something. It creates an output, and usually this output is what the user wants. Now, the interesting thing about a feedback loop is that this output then affects the input again. And since the output is produced based on the input of a system, the output by proxy affects itself. The input and the output form a closed loop here, with each part affecting the other part of the loop. It can be very useful to think about what the opposite of a feedback loop is. And in cybernetics, that would be an open loop. So in an open loop, there is no connection between the output of a system at one point in time and the input of the system in the future. So the system just looks like that. We have the input controlling the system producing an output, but then there is no relationship between the output and the input that we had in the feedback loop. And a lot of the systems that we use in our day-to-day life are actually open loops and not feedback loops. For example, a washer. A washer basically needs two inputs. First of all, we have to put in the laundry that should be cleaned, and then the user has to define the program that the washer should run. This would be the input, and based on these inputs, the washer hopefully produces clean clothes. But once those clothes have been washed, they don't affect the future behavior of the washer. So when we want to deal with more laundry, we would still have to put in the laundry and still define a program. And there's no relationship between what the washer produces in one run and what the washer does in the next run. They're completely independent of each other, and that makes it an open loop. Now, in the closed loop, the output of the system literally feeds back into the input, and that's why they're called feedback loops. So it would be this diagram that we already looked at. Input controlling the system produces an output, and that output then affects the input. For a real-life example, let's think about the thermostat. That is a device that regulates the temperature in indoor rooms. When you're working with a thermostat, you just define the temperature that this room should have, and the system takes as an input the current temperature of the room and compares it to the desired temperature that you set. And based on the difference between those two, the current state and the desired state, heat is produced to reduce the difference. And obviously, when we're producing hot air, that then affects the room temperature that is measured by the thermostat. This connection between the two results in an interesting behavior, whereas the overall temperature of the room rises, less and less heat has to be applied to reach the desired temperature. Because of the connection between heat and the room temperature here, between input and output, this would be a closed loop or a feedback loop. And feedback loops traditionally come in two basic forms. First of all, there are negative feedback loops. So this would be a loop where the output balances out the input over time. And the thermostat that we already talked about is an example of that, because as we said, as the room temperature increases, less and less heat has to be applied. So as the input of the system increases, the output decreases. Usually having a negative feedback loop means that the output somehow works against the input, it counteracts it, and that means that existing tendencies in your system are dampened. In the example of the thermostat, the room warms up, that would be a tendency, and that is dampened by the fact that then less and less heat is applied, so that the room doesn't become incredibly hot after a while. And overall, a feedback loop of this type, a negative feedback loop, leads to convergent behavior. So there's a certain desirable state or a goal that the system works towards. In the thermostat, the goal would be reaching the desired temperature, and the output of our system, the produced heat, makes sure that our room temperature slowly approaches the desired temperature. So the current state converges to the goal state. The other type of feedback loop is a positive feedback loop, where the output reinforces the input. And that would mean that the input is amplified over time. Instead of dampening existing tendencies or dynamics in the system, those are actually intensified. And to give you an example of a positive feedback loop, let's imagine the thermostat in our room is malfunctioning. And what it does is that as the room gets warmer and warmer, as the current temperature increases, it doesn't apply less heat but more heat. That would be an example of a positive feedback loop. And it would quickly lead to an extreme result where the room is way too hot to live in. Here the overall state of the system doesn't converge to some sort of goal state, but it keeps going in the same direction, becoming more and more extreme, and that would be labeled as divergent behavior. I think the example of the malfunctioning thermostat already shows you that the terms positive and negative feedback loop does not mean that this type of feedback loop is desirable or undesirable for the user. Instead, what positive and negative mean in this context is how the system reacts to an upcoming dynamic or tendency. The negative feedback loop balances out upcoming tendencies, so it's negative towards a dynamic, and the positive feedback loop reinforces upcoming dynamics, so it's positive towards them. So much for what cybernetics can tell us about feedback loops. Now let's try to apply this more to games. And in games, a feedback loop often determines how a success or a failure at one point in the game facilitates future successes or failures. Let's start with some basic examples of positive feedback loops where a certain state is reinforced. Think about a basic RPG where the player kills enemies. By killing enemies, the player gains loot, which includes new equipment that they can put on, and having that equipment makes it easier for the player to kill more enemies. Which means that as you're doing well in the game, as you're defeating your enemies, it becomes easier and easier for you to keep doing that. So it's clear that this is a positive feedback loop, reinforcing the tendency that the player is able to defeat their enemies by giving them more tools to do so. And this type of behavior, where the player becomes stronger and stronger through an activity that becomes easier and easier for them to execute, is usually called snowballing. But a positive feedback loop could also look completely differently. It could be that we implement a rule where every time that the player dies in our game, they lose part of the equipment that they're currently wearing, which means that their stats would be reduced, and that would make it more likely that the player dies again and again and again. And in this case, this would not be labeled snowballing, but a death spiral that is very hard to escape. So this again just stresses the point that positive feedback loop doesn't mean desirable for the player. It could be very desirable in the case of snowballing, but in the case of death spiral that you can see here, it's not something the player wants to happen, but it's still an example of a positive feedback loop. Now for negative feedback loops, where existing tendencies are dampened by an output that counteracts them, let's think about a basic racing game. We could, for example, implement a rule that when our player falls behind, they could gain a speed boost for a while, which would prevent them from falling behind further and instead give them an opportunity to come back. And something like this would usually be called a catch-up mechanic. This is obviously a negative feedback loop because giving the player a boost of speed counteracts the tendency of falling behind. And in this particular scenario, this would be a mechanic that is desirable for the player, even though it's a negative feedback loop. Again, the negative feedback loop could also be structured in a different way. For example, if we just turn it around, when the player gets ahead of their enemies, when it looks like our player is winning, we could increase the general speed of the opponent's cars. And that would prevent the player from getting ahead even further and instead produce a closer match. And this is actually done in a lot of racing games to the AI, where as your distance to the other AI drivers increases, the AI is able to drive faster. This is sometimes called rubber banding. But more generally, a negative feedback loop like this would be a holdback mechanic that prevents the player from becoming a runaway leader and instead gives the enemies a chance to come back. Now that you know about some basic applications of feedback loops in video games, let's talk about where feedback loops are situated in a scheme of game design. On a high level, game design splits into two different areas. It splits into system design and content design. System design is all about defining the rules of the game, how they interact with each other, and grouping them in meaningful units. For example, you can have a movement system that determines what actions are available for the player to traverse the environment, their speed, and so on. And a lot of games have a combat system and often item management or an inventory system. And then on the other hand, we have content design, which would be creating the specific assets that our player encounters during gameplay. This would mean designing the levels that our player has to traverse, creating the enemies that we have to fight as part of the combat system, or creating the items that then go into our inventory system. And when you think about this distinction between system design and content design, feedback loops are usually used to enhance the system design, which shouldn't be a big surprise considering that feedback loops are studied in cybernetics, the study of systems. And more specifically than just enhancing the systems in our game, the goal of feedback loops is usually to control the dynamics that come up during play. As game designers, of course, it is our goal to create an engaging experience, but we cannot design this experience directly. We instead have to create the rules and the assets of our game. And when those rules and assets that we designed interact with each other, they create an experience for the player. And if we want to influence how the experience of play really looks like, then we have to control the dynamics that our game creates when different parts interact with each other. And that is where feedback loops really come into play. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why feedback loops are incredibly important and why I think that this is a game design tool that you should be familiar with. The first reason being that feedback loops help us create emergent behavior in our games, meaning that the game as a whole experience exhibits certain characteristics that each of the single parts that make up the game don't have by themselves. And related to that is the concept of meta stability, which basically means that you have a system where all of the individual parts are constantly changing, constantly in flux, but the system as a whole still shows certain stable patterns over time. And this is of course desirable for games because even though we want every round of our game to feel a little bit different, if we're going for replayability, there should still be certain consistent characteristics that our game exhibits in every round. If there's no such thing like that, our game doesn't really have an identity. Also, the advantage of using closed loops or feedback loops is that they can dynamically react to different situations and also players of different skill levels. And this flexibility comes from the fact that feedback loops are in some way monitoring themselves by checking for certain tendencies in the input and then either reinforcing them or balancing them out based on the type of feedback loop that you're using. Also, as already discussed, feedback loops have a huge impact on the dynamics that your game creates during a play session. And if you want to make sure that those dynamics that players actually experience come close to what you imagine, feedback loops are one of the most useful tools to achieve that. In addition to that, we have to be aware of the feedback loops in our games because unintentional feedback loops can have catastrophic consequences because of their huge impact on game dynamics. And you can actually go online and read articles about games that ship with feedback loops that the game designers weren't really aware of and that had to be fixed later on. And finally, feedback loops influence core aspects of game design, such as balancing, making sure that each part of the game is properly tuned in relationship to all the other parts, and especially in multiplayer games, creating a sense of fairness. Positive feedback loops specifically are often used as part of the progression system of our game, and overall both types of feedback loops ensure that your player stays motivated during play. And if you screw up one or more of these aspects, balancing, progression, and player motivation, you can almost be certain that players will quit your game and never return to it. So these are fundamental aspects to get right, and feedback loops can help you do that. Despite those more or less universal qualities of feedback loops, of course there are games where feedback loops are even more important. And they are highly relevant for ludic games, so games that rely heavily on systems and mechanics instead of trying to tell some kind of sophisticated story. In those kinds of games, it is very important to create emergence. So from just having a short list of comprehensible rules, you want to be able to create a lot of different gameplay situations, like for example in chess. Creating emergent complexity in a game from just a few components is what a lot of game designers would call elegant game design, and that's exactly what they're striving for when creating a ludic game. The other type of game that feedback loops are particularly relevant for are multiplayer games. A game like League of Legends is meant to be played over and over again, even though the rules never change drastically, and so those kinds of games they really have to nail the dynamics that come up during play to keep every round interesting. And like we discussed before, feedback loops are a very efficient tool to get those play dynamics right. Okay, now that we know why we should care about feedback loops and when they're particularly important, let's think about how feedback loops are structured. And the basic cybernetic feedback loop consists of three different parts. First of all, there is a sensor, and that sensor measures either the state of the system itself or the state of its environment. The data of the sensor is then forwarded to a comparator, and the job of the comparator is to interpret that data of the sensor and then to decide whether or not the feedback loop has to be activated, whether or not the system should intervene. If so, the comparator enables the activator, and the activator is the element that then produces an output that affects the system or the environment, and it should specifically affect whatever the sensor is measuring to close the loop. Applied to the example of the thermostat that we talked about before, there's a thermometer that measures the temperature in your room. The thermostat is just a control unit that compares the data of the thermometer to the user-defined temperature and then decides whether or not heat has to be applied. So it's the comparator part in this feedback loop. And then the thermostat activates the heater, which produces hot air and affects the room temperature measured by the thermometer. So the heater would be the activator. In games, feedback loops are structured in a very similar way, just that here we have the game state. You can think of the game state as a collection of all the variables of the game at a particular point in time. So in an RPG, it would be the position of your character, how much health points you have left, all of the items that are equipped, the locations of nearby enemies, and so on. Then there's a measuring function, which analyzes a particular part of the game state. And even though measuring function is a big word, it could just be a single line in your code that checks for a particular variable in the game. Then there's the controller that has the similar function as the comparator in the basic cybernetic model. It somehow interprets the result of a measuring function and decides whether or not the feedback loop has to be activated, and if so, in what capacity it should work. And then the controller introduces some sort of mechanical bias. And that bias then affects the game state, closing the loop. This mechanical bias would, for example, be the speed boost that we talked about before that would be activated when the player falls behind. If we look at this visualization of the structure, there are basically four questions that we as a designer have to answer. First of all, when we think about the game state and the measuring function, we of course have to determine which aspect of the game state is measured. And the real question here is which aspect of the game state is representative of a certain dynamic that we either want to reinforce or balance out. Then from measuring function to controller, the question is which conditions have to be met so that our feedback loop is activated. Is it running all the time, or does the measured variable have to surpass certain thresholds? Then of course we have to determine which bias our controller introduces into the game, and this doesn't have to be a single one. It could be different biases based on the result of our measuring function. And then the last question would be, how does the bias that we introduce affect the game state? And we have to make sure that the mechanical bias we're introducing affects those aspects of the game state that we're measuring. Otherwise, it's not really a feedback loop. So much for the anatomy of a feedback loop, the different parts that go into it. Now let's try to apply what we've learned to a particular game. And we'll analyze the feedback loops that are used in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, the dynamics they create during play, and how all of that relates to the intentions of the game designers at Nintendo. For a basic introduction, Mario Kart 8 is an arcade racing game developed and published by Nintendo. In the game you compete against your friends or against strangers online in short races and levels of the Nintendo universe. And the unique thing that the Mario Kart series is famous for are the different items that you can pick up and use to either boost your own vehicle or to damage the vehicles of your opponents and impede their progress. The interesting thing is that the Mario Kart series makes great use of feedback loops, and in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe there are 3 different negative feedback loops at work. The first of which is the distribution of items. So the way the game decides what items you receive is already a kind of feedback loop. Basically, when you collide with one of those mystery boxes with a question mark, you're given a random item from a selection of maybe a dozen items that are programmed into the game. And it's interesting that players who are further ahead receive less useful items than players who are behind. When you're in second place, you might only receive a coin that boosts your speed by a bit, whereas when you're in the lower ranks, you might receive the blue shell, which is basically a homing missile that targets the person in first place and causes a big explosion. Interestingly, the probabilities with which you receive one of those items depends on your distance to the front runner, so to the driver in first place, and is actually not dependent on your actual rank, whether you're in second or fifth place. And we can talk later about why the distance to the front runner is the variable that they're analyzing here. So represented as a feedback loop, we have the distance to the front runner, which increases our likelihood of receiving powerful items. Receiving and using those powerful items then hopefully reduces our distance to the front runner and lets us catch up or even overtake them. If we take a closer look at the actual structure, there is the game state with all the variables. We have the positions of the players, their current speed, the vehicles they choose, and so on. Then our measuring function analyzes an aspect of the game state, which in this case is the distance to the front runner. And it was a clever decision to choose the distance to the front runner as the defining variable, because just looking at the rank doesn't give you as much information about whether or not a certain match is really close or one-sided. When you're in second seed, it could be that the person in the first seed is right ahead of you, just a couple of meters away, or it could be that they're already so far ahead that you don't even get to see them anymore. So the distance to the front runner is a much better, a more precise indicator of whether or not items are needed to make the match closer. Then the controller here would be the probability table that I showed you that determines based on the distance which items have which probabilities. And the mechanical bias that is introduced is just the item that we get and that we can use to then affect the game state. So item distribution is our first negative feedback loop here. Also related to the items, we have the actual effects of the items, which is the second negative feedback loop. And that is because the majority of items disproportionately affects players ahead of the person using the item. So if we think about those items that only really affect players in front of the user, we have the bullet bill that you can activate to go into some sort of automatic driving mode and can knock away your enemies by colliding with them. And since this gives you a speed boost, it really only affects those who are ahead of you when you use the item. Same thing goes for the star item that also boosts your speed for a while and lets you knock away enemies when colliding with them. The blue shell we already talked about, a homing missile that targets the person in first seed, but also on its way to the person in first seed, it knocks away all opponents it collides with, and when it reaches its goal, it causes a big explosion that can also hit multiple opponents. So even though it targets a person in first seed, it usually affects more than just this one opponent. And then there is the piranha plant that bites nearby opponents ahead of the player. While using that item, your driver is more resistant to slowdowns that would usually be caused by certain types of terrain, which means that with this item you're usually a bit faster, and because of that the piranha plant only affects players in front of the person using it. Then we also have items that mostly affect players in front of the user, the red shell, the green shell, and the boomerang. If you shoot the red shell forward, it acts as a homing missile to the player right in front of the user. You can also fire it backwards, but then it loses its goal-seeking quality, so then it just goes in a straight line, which makes it harder to hit the red shell. Even though you got both options here, firing it forward and backwards, firing forward is clearly incentivized through the functionality of the red shell. Then we have the green shell that always moves in a straight line, no matter where you fire it. But here I would say it's still incentivized to fire it forward because it's easier to aim that way. If you want to shoot it backwards, first of all, you don't see that much of what's going on behind you. And you could activate the back camera, but that would make it harder for you to drive for some time. So it's just easier to fire it forward. And then the same thing goes for the boomerang, an item that you can throw to hit nearby enemies. You can throw it forward and backward too, but again, because you're able to see much more of what's going on ahead of you, it's easier to fire it forward. And lastly, there are a few items that are mostly used to affect players behind the user. There's the bomb, a bomb that you can place at your current location or that you can throw. But since you can be hit by the explosion yourself, and because the curve that it takes when you throw it is quite weird and hard to aim, most players tend to just drop it at the current location and use it to stop the players right behind them. And the same thing goes for the banana, which you may either drop at your current location or throw forward. But again, quite hard to hit when you throw it, so most people just decide to drop it. So if we take those effects into account, we can see that there's a feedback loop where the number of opponents that are behind the player increases the opportunities to be hit by various items of those players. And being hit by an item then gives the other players an opportunity to pass by, which would then reduce the number of opponents behind the player, forming another negative feedback loop. Those were the item effects. And lastly, the last type of feedback loop here, also a negative one, is a mechanic called the slipstream boost. What the slipstream boost does is that when you're driving right behind an opponent for some time, you gain this very effective speed boost that only lasts a couple of seconds, but it's usually enough to let you overtake the opponent that gave you this slipstream boost. This again forms a negative feedback loop where having more opponents ahead of you increases your opportunities to use the slipstream, which lets you overtake them and thus reduce the number of opponents ahead of you. So as we can see, there are three different kinds of feedback loops in Mario Kart. We have the distribution of the items. Players who are struggling receive better items than those who are doing well. Then we have the item effects that disproportionately affect those players ahead of the person using them. And then we have the slipstream boost, where with more players ahead of us, there are more opportunities to gain the slipstream boost and overtake them. Three different mechanics, but all of them are negative feedback loops. And if we take them together, there are a couple of different effects or dynamics those loops create during play. Firstly, the leading and the trailing players always have to stay focused in Mario Kart. The leading players can never be sure that they will stay ahead, because a blue shell might hit them and they don't get the useful items that would bring them further ahead. And the trailing players also stay focused because they always have an opportunity to come back, because they receive better items, because they have more opportunities to use the slipstream boost, and because they are rarely affected by the items of other players. Another effect of those feedback loops is that what you do late in the game is much more important than what you do early in the game. If you make a mistake early on, it's not that important because there is enough time for the feedback loops to become active and help you come back. Whereas when you're playing well very late into the game, like overtaking an opponent right before the finish line, there is not enough time for the feedback loops to balance out this action. Also, mainly because of the item system, players at either end of the spectrum, those who are really far ahead and those who are really far behind, are drawn back towards the pack of other players, towards the center of action. And here again, it was very clever to take the distance to the front runner as the variable determining the items that you receive, because in the end, taking that as a variable means that ultimately the distance to the front runner will be reduced. And when both the players who are far ahead and the players who are far behind are drawn back towards the center of action, towards where most of the other players are, that obviously results in more interactive gameplay, where there are more opportunities to overtake other opponents, to hit them with your items, to tackle them off the track, and so on. Another consequence of drawing the players together and then having a mechanic like the slipstream boost that lets you overtake players right ahead of you is that positions change frequently in Mario Kart. It's really rare that a player gets an advantage early on and then continues to have this advantage until the very end. It's much more likely that at some point during the match you're somewhere in the middle ranks, at some point you get in the top ranks, and maybe at some point you're even in the lower ranks, and all of that can happen within the same round because the positions can change very quickly. And lastly, because the items have such a huge impact on the game, it is definitely possible for bad players to beat players who are much better than them just through item luck. And that happens frequently in Mario Kart, and it's actually a source of complaint for the more competitive players. If we look at these 5 different effects and relate this back to what were probably the intentions of the designers, we can see how those create an action-packed party game with loads of interactions between the different players that remains exciting to the very end, because there's always an opportunity to come back, and because what you do late in the game is more important than what you do early on, and a game that can be enjoyed by players of very different skill levels, because getting the right items and using them efficiently is just as important, or sometimes even more important, than your actual driving skills. And when the skill differences are not always important for the actual outcome, this makes Mario Kart 8 a game that can be enjoyed in very diverse groups of players, making it a game that, for example, kids can play with their parents. Okay, now moving away from the specific case study of Mario Kart, let's try to generalize and discuss what kinds of effects certain types of feedback loops tend to create. Starting with positive feedback loops, they ultimately destabilize the system because they're amplifying an existing tendency over and over again, and so slowly push the system towards extreme states. More applied to games, this usually means that successes early in the game are magnified because the feedback loop keeps reinforcing them. If you think about games that snowball too hard, where everything is already decided in the early game, then that probably means that there is a too powerful positive feedback loop. Also, if your game doesn't have a fixed duration, but instead it depends on one team or one player getting ahead to a certain degree so they can end the game, then what a positive feedback loop usually does is that the game is brought to a conclusion much faster. Positive feedback loops reward those who are already winning in the game and punishes those who are losing. And positive feedback loops amplify differences between players of different skill levels or between players who chose different strategies, and by amplifying it highlights those differences. If you visualize the effects of a positive feedback loop, you will often create graphs of either exponential growth or exponential decline. And lastly, positive feedback loops are often part of a game's progression system because the exponential growth that they create is very well suited to convey a sense of empowerment and getting ahead. On the other hand, the negative feedback loops are pretty much the opposite. They lead to convergent behavior of a system, so they ultimately stabilize the system and reach some sort of equilibrium in the long run. That often means that late successes are more important than early successes, as we have seen in Mario Kart, because the feedback loop simply doesn't have enough time to balance out those successes. And if the game doesn't have a fixed duration, but it's all about reaching a certain critical difference between two parties, then having a negative feedback loop obviously prolongs the game and increases the overall duration. Instead of punishing the losers, negative feedback loops forgive losers and sometimes even punish those players who are doing very well. Instead of highlighting differences between players and their chosen strategies, negative feedback loops balance out those differences and thus hide them. The effects usually result in graphs of periodic ups and downs, almost like a sine curve when you visualize them. And if we think more about the actual dynamic that is created, negative feedback loops tend to produce quick changes of fortune, where at one point you fall behind, but you have the opportunity for a comeback and then take over the lead. And this usually makes for good drama. Despite those characteristics that we can use for our game design, there are also specific dangers that we have to pay attention to. And the danger of too powerful positive feedback is escalation. So by pushing the system towards an extreme, we can either cause the explosion of the system or the collapse of it. And sometimes this is true literally, as in the case of bridge collapses that are sometimes the result of a positive feedback loop where the bridge starts to swing harder and harder until it collapses. More specific to games, if a positive feedback loop is too strong, there is a lack of uncertainty of outcome. Since the feedback loop only works in one direction, when a player gets an advantage in the early game, this advantage will only be amplified. And just having positive feedback loops also means that there's no real opportunity to come back. In that sense, you can create a game that snowballs too hard and where the game is technically over already after a couple of minutes, and the people have to keep playing even though the outcome is already decided. A good sign that a positive feedback loop is too strong in your game is, for example, when there's a built-in function in your game to surrender, to give up, and players already want to use it early in the game. That would mean that for them the outcome is already decided and everything else is just a waste of time. The danger of negative feedback is stagnation, so there's no more meaningful change in the system and everything becomes predictable. It's like watching a pendulum for some time. It will just get boring because you already know what is going to happen with the system in the future. Applied to games, the danger of negative feedback is a lack of reward for good performance. So if the built-in system punishes those who are doing well and rewards those who are doing poorly, there's no real incentive to play well in the first place. And in some games that can even lead to players performing poorly on purpose so that they at least benefit from the feedback loops in the game. The interesting thing here is that an overuse of both types of feedback loops, negative and positive, results in the same effects, which would be a feeling of unfairness and lack of control for the player. If you have a strong positive feedback loop and everything is decided in the early game already, even a little mistake can screw up the entire game, which would feel unfair. Whereas when you have a negative feedback loop, players might feel like what they do early in the game has no influence on the outcome at all, which would also be unfair. So the question is, what can we do when one of our feedback loops is too powerful and starts determining the whole game? One way to tackle this issue would be to create another loop that works in the opposite direction of the too powerful loop. Imagine, for example, you have a game where once you start acquiring some money, it becomes much easier for you to acquire more money. So you might have a too strong positive feedback loop where players get rich pretty quickly. Then you could, for example, introduce a negative feedback loop where the prices of things that the player wants to buy are higher the more money they have, and that would then work against the positive money loop. We can also weaken the effects of a feedback loop by introducing an element of chance. And Mario Kart, that we discussed before, uses this method with the item distribution. So to make sure that the items don't control everything, there is an element of chance, because the distance to the front runner only affects the probabilities of receiving a more powerful item. You're not guaranteed to get a blue shell or a bullet bill just because you're far behind. Another thing we could do to contain the effects of a feedback loop would be to introduce limits and caps to it. So if we think about a basic RPG where you kill enemies, that gives you experience points. Those experience points increase your level, which increases your stats, which makes it easier for you to kill enemies. There we have an example of a positive feedback loop, and it could make it very easy to just farm experience points by killing the same monsters over and over again. If we were to introduce a limit, we could say, for example, that you no longer gain experience points from slaying a monster that is too many levels below the level of our character, and this would force our player to look for more powerful monsters to defeat. Another thing we could do is to add a mechanic that counters the effects of the feedback loop, even though this counter mechanic doesn't have to be a feedback loop itself. If we think back about this example of a game where having more money makes it easier for you to get even more money, a counter mechanic would be a random event where you lose all your money, no matter how much you have. Even though this is not a feedback loop, of course it hurts much more to get this event as a player with a lot of money than with somebody who doesn't have that much. And lastly, if the feedback loop determines the outcome of a game all the time, we can think about defining victory and failure in a game in other terms. So we remove the effects of the loop from the actual win conditions, so they're no longer directly connected. In the example of our game with the positive money feedback loop, you could say that victory is no longer about gaining $1 million, but maybe it's about acquiring property, and buying it with money is only one way to achieve that. You could also inherit buildings, for example, and that would at least to a certain degree remove money from the victory condition. Alright, now that we know about the common effects of positive and negative feedback loops, their dangers, and how we could fix an overly powerful feedback loop, let's talk about additional ways to categorize feedback loops apart from just the distinction between positive and negative. Firstly, feedback loops can be constructive or destructive. Remember back when we said earlier on that the terms positive and negative feedback loops don't refer to something that is desirable to the player or that is not desirable to the player? It actually still makes sense to draw this distinction, because otherwise snowballing and a death spiral would both be referred to as positive feedback loops. And in some scenarios it simply makes sense to distinguish between those two by giving them a different name. So a constructive feedback loop is one that either brings the player closer to the victory condition of a game or further away from the failure condition, which basically means that the effects of this loop are desirable for the player. If we take the example of, let's just say, a hack and slay game where our goal is to defeat all the enemies that are on screen without dying, a constructive feedback loop could look like that. Every time our player kills an enemy, it increases the damage they do to those types of enemies, which would facilitate killing more enemies. And I think you can already see here that this would form a positive feedback loop that is constructive. In that same scenario with the same victory condition, we could also construct a negative feedback loop that is constructive. For example, every time the player takes damage, so a negative event for the player, we increase their armor, which reduces the damage they take in the future. In this case, it doesn't make it easier to defeat all enemies, but it makes it more likely that we die, which would be the failure condition in this case. And increasing armor works against taking damage, so this is a negative constructive feedback loop. A destructive feedback loop is obviously the opposite of that. It's a loop with undesirable effects, where the player is either brought closer to the failure condition or further away from the victory condition. If we take the example of a racing game and define the victory condition as finish the race first, a destructive feedback loop might look like that. Every time the player drops a rank when they're overtaken by an opponent, we could reduce their speed for a while, which would make it more likely that the player drops additional ranks. This is definitely something the player does not want to happen, so it's destructive, and it's an example of a positive feedback loop, because the event that causes the decrease in speed, the player dropping the rank, makes that same event more likely. We could make this a negative destructive feedback loop by just turning the event causing the decrease in speed into its opposite. So every time that the player gains a rank, when we overtake an opponent, we reduce the speed of the player's car, which would decrease the likelihood of overtaking additional opponents and gaining even more ranks, and instead makes it more likely that we're directly overtaken again. So a clear example of a negative feedback loop, because the decrease in speed works against gaining additional ranks. This distinction between constructive and destructive feedback loops seems to be so important that there are many different names for it actually, especially for positive feedback loops of either type. So destructive positive feedback loops, where things get worse and worse, are sometimes called downward spirals or vicious circles. You're probably familiar with those terms from other areas like economics, for example. And on the other hand, we have constructive positive feedback loops where things get better and better that are sometimes called virtuous circles. So just remember, if you come across one of those terms, they refer to a constructive positive feedback loop or a destructive positive feedback loop. But both of them are positive feedback loops. So this distinction between constructive and destructive obviously refers to the connection of the effects of the feedback loops to the victory or failure condition, but we could also categorize feedback loops based on how the produced output affects the input, and that would be a distinction between direct and indirect feedback loops. In a direct or non-transitive feedback loop, we have our input A that goes into the system, and based on the input, an output B is produced, and that output then feeds back into the input. So this diagram is the one you're already familiar with from the start of this lecture. And the direct part here is that the output B directly affects the input A, and there is no extra step in between. An example of a direct or non-transitive feedback loop would be your bank account. You gain interest based on how much money you have, and the money from those interests is directly put onto your bank account again. This direct connection makes it a non-transitive feedback loop. On the other hand, we have indirect or transitive feedback loops. And here the input A comes into the system, output B is produced, but instead of affecting input A directly, output B affects a variable C, which in turn affects the input. And it's important to note here that it doesn't have to be one extra step in between. It could be multiple. It could be that variable C first influences variable D, then E, and only then influences input A. Here we can take an example from games, one we already talked about. In an RPG, you kill monsters, which facilitates killing more monsters. But actually that's a bit of a simplification because killing monsters doesn't directly make it easier to kill more monsters. Instead, for example, we gain gold from killing a monster. We can use that gold to buy new equipment. We can put on the equipment to increase our stats, and only that increase in our character stats then makes it easier to kill additional monsters. So you can see that there are two extra steps in between receiving more gold and killing more monsters. From a game design perspective, if you have a transitive feedback loop with steps in between the output and the input, it makes it much harder for your player to recognize the feedback loop as such. So if you want your players to notice the feedback loop and use it as a strategic opportunity, it's usually a better idea to go with a direct feedback loop. But of course, the advantage of an indirect or transitive feedback loop is that you have all these extra steps that you can fine-tune and balance. So there are many more knobs that you can turn to really fine-tune the effects of your feedback loop. And then feedback loops can also be continuous or discrete. And in a continuous loop, the precise value of the input matters for the output that is produced. So even a small difference in the input can already cause a different output. You can use the same example of interests on your bank account, since those interests are determined by a percentage. Whether you have $500 on your account, 600 or 800 makes a difference in how much money you gain from the interest. So this would be a continuous loop. In comparison to that, a discrete loop works in steps, so our input has to surpass certain thresholds that we define, and only then it causes a different output. And that obviously means that small differences in the input are sometimes ignored. For example, we could rework the interest system to be a discrete feedback loop, where instead of making it dependent on a percentage, we could say that for every $1,000 you own, you gain 10 additional dollars as interest. In that case, it would no longer make a difference whether there are $500, $600, or $800 on your bank account. It would result in the same interest. The appeal of a discrete loop for a designer is that you are the one who can determine how many thresholds there are and when exactly the output changes based on the input. So there's much more control over the effects of the feedback loop. On the other hand, the advantage of the continuous loop is that it's, first of all, easier to understand because you don't have to know about all those different thresholds. The loop always works according to the same rules. And since small difference in input can already produce different outputs, having a continuous loop gives the player more granular decisions that they can make. Now, with those different types of categories in mind, constructive and destructive feedback loops, discrete and continuous feedback loops, and direct and indirect feedback loops, let's apply what we've learned to another game. And this time we will look at feedback loops in Riot Games' Teamfight Tactics. Teamfight Tactics is an auto-battler in the League of Legends universe. You compete against 8 players online, and you basically have to buy units, upgrade them, and put together a team of different champions. Then in different rounds, your team competes against the teams of other players, and if you lose one of those combat rounds, you lose health points. When your health points hit 0, you're out of the game, and the last player to survive wins the game of Teamfight Tactics. The first example of a positive feedback loop here is the interest system that allows the players who are already rich to get even richer. The way the system works is that for every 10 gold you own, you gain an additional 1 gold each round. And you can see in the image here that the player gains 5 additional gold per round, so he owns 50 or more gold in total. Represented as the feedback loop, we have the total gold of the player, which increases the gold we earn from interest each round, which in turn increases the total gold we have. And I think by now you immediately recognize that this is an example of a positive feedback loop. Having money leads to earning more money, which leads to having more money in the future. Thinking about our different categories, first of all, this is a constructive feedback loop, because having more gold generally helps you do better in the game, even though the connection there is quite indirect, but we'll talk about that later. This loop itself is non-transitive, it's direct, because the gold from interest directly feeds into your total gold, which directly affects the gold from interest. There is no extra step in between. And it's a discrete mechanism because the gold earned from interest only increases with every 10 gold you own. And it doesn't make a difference whether you have 42, 44 or 47 gold. All of those options would result in 4 gold from the interest. When we talked about the common effects that positive feedback loops tend to create, we pointed out that successes early in the game are magnified. And that is exactly what's happening here. The interest system rewards those who start saving money early on. And because of that, it enables a strategy where players just save money early in the game and don't spend anything, even though it leads to them losing health points because they're not upgrading their team. But then they gain all the benefits from the interest system in the long run. So not spending money early becomes a viable strategy in teamfight tactics. Since every unregulated positive feedback loop leads to the collapse or explosion of the system, as we've talked about, of course there are certain regulations on the interest system. First of all, there's an interest limit. You can gain a maximum of 5 gold per round from the interest, which means that saving more than 50 gold doesn't make a difference anymore. And that certainly leads to a point in time where players just have to spend their money because saving no longer makes sense. The other limit on this loop is the distance to the win condition. Even though you definitely receive more gold from using the interest system, having more gold doesn't guarantee a victory in teamfight tactics. Instead, gold has to be used to roll champions, so you get a random selection of champions you can buy, or you can use gold to increase the amount of units that you can put on the field. But both of these options don't guarantee that you will actually win the round. And there's no direct connection between gold and the health points that are critical for the victory condition, so you can't spend money to regain health in teamfight tactics. And that obviously makes saving money early on a dangerous strategy, because the health points that you lose by employing the strategy you will never get back. Another feedback loop is the streak system, and the streak system actually rewards winners and losers alike. So players who win a couple of combat rounds in a row earn extra money each round, and the same thing applies to players who lose a couple of rounds in a row. In the example shown here, the player is on a win streak of 4 consecutive victories, so they gain an additional gold each round. If they manage to defeat their enemy in the next combat round, they would get +2, as you can see in the tooltip here. So the feedback loop looks like this. We have victories, which increase our total gold, which facilitates additional victories, because we can use the money to upgrade our team. That is the positive feedback loop here. But then there's also the defeats that also increase our total gold, which should prevent us from losing in the future. You can already see that this streak system is an interesting combination of a positive and a negative feedback loop merged into one mechanism. The only players who don't benefit from the system at all are those somewhere in the middle ranks that have alternating victories and defeats. The ones who are far ahead and who keep winning benefit from the system, and those who are far behind and just lose all the time also benefit from it. Those two feedback loops are both constructive. Having more money is desirable for the player. It's transitive in nature, because as we already discussed before, gold doesn't directly make it easier for you to win combat rounds. Just gives you better chances because you could upgrade your units. And it's a discrete mechanism because there are clearly defined thresholds at which you gain more money from the streak. The streak system has quite an interesting effect on the actual gameplay because it makes two opposing strategies equally viable. First of all, the strategy of saving all your money early on and accepting that you lose a couple of combat rounds becomes possible because then you benefit from the negative feedback loop of the streak system. But also the complete opposite, where you spend all of your money early on to build a very strong team quickly, now becomes possible because you then benefit from the positive feedback loop part, where victories increase your total gold. Here also, the designers added a couple of ways in which this feedback loop is regulated. First of all, there is a hard limit on this. You can only gain a maximum of 3 gold per round from the streak system. Again, it's transitive in nature. Having more gold doesn't guarantee that you will keep winning or that you will suddenly break out of your losing streak. And its effects are obviously constrained by the fact that both winners and losers benefit from it. And the only ones who don't benefit from this system are those who are neither on a winning nor on a losing streak. Lastly, there is a mechanism called the carousel. So every once in a while, players are brought to this carousel where they find a random selection of units that are already equipped with an item, and then players take turns choosing one of those units with an item from this random selection. And the interesting part here is that the order is determined by how many health points you have left. So players with few health points get to choose the unit and their item first, whereas players who have a lot of health points left have to wait until the end and then obviously have less units and items to draw from. So we can see here that losing health increases your options in the carousel, which should prevent you from losing more health in the future and should enable you to come back in a way. This is of course a negative feedback loop, because having more options should make it less likely that you keep on losing health. And it's a constructive mechanism. Having those options is something very desirable for players in Teamfight Tactics. Again, it is transitive, because getting a unit and an item of your choice again doesn't guarantee you that you'll stop losing health points. It just drastically improves your chances. And I would say it's less transitive than the streaks, for example, because the carousel is actually the only place in Teamfight Tactics where you get to choose a unit from larger selections, where it's not that random, and also the only place where you can choose an item and don't just get a random one. So the carousel is really where you have strategic choice, and this definitely has a stronger impact on how well you're doing in the game compared to just having a bit more money. Because of the fact that in the carousel you rely less on randomness than in the other parts of the game, I would actually argue that it's the most powerful feedback mechanism in Teamfight Tactics. But of course it's also regulated. First of all, the carousel is a rare event and it doesn't occur that many times in a game of Teamfight Tactics. Also, usually there are 2 players who choose their unit and the item simultaneously, which often has the effect that players who are close together in terms of their health points also get to choose at the same time. And also, as more and more players get eliminated in Teamfight Tactics, the good players have more options left in the carousel later on, because the amount of random units that you can pick from actually doesn't change over the course of the game. Okay, so to conclude, we can see that Teamfight Tactics combines different kinds of positive and negative feedback. We have the interest system, which is a basic positive feedback loop that rewards players who save money early on. It's a constructive, direct mechanism that works in discrete steps. Then we have the streak system, a combination of a positive and negative feedback loop that rewards those who are doing very well and those who are struggling. For both types of players, it's constructive. It's transitive because having more money doesn't mean you'll continue your victory streak or break your losing streak. And again, it's a discrete mechanism with clearly defined thresholds. And lastly, we have the carousel system that lets players with low health points make their choice of a unit with an item first. This is a classic negative feedback loop that is also constructive and indirect, but less so than the streak system, because units and items are more directly connected to dealing damage to the other players and not losing health yourself. If we take these 3 loops together, again they create some effects. First of all, they make different strategies viable, either saving money early on and risking losing some health points, or spending all your money early on and building a strong team quickly to benefit from the streak system. There's a lot of movement in the middle and lower ranks. They change a lot because especially the middle ranks don't benefit from the streak system, whereas the lower ranks do. Comebacks are always possible, especially because of the carousel that could give you just the right unit that you've been looking for or the right item. And you can not only use it to get the item or unit that you wanted, but also to steal the unit or the item that you think the good players might want. And even though a comeback is always a possibility, those players who are doing well in the early game are also rewarded for that, because they either benefit from the positive feedback loop of the streak system, or because they're not struggling with health points, so it's easier for them to save money at some point. I hope this example has shown you how the specific design decisions create real effects in the dynamics of the game that you can observe all the time when Teamfight Tactics is played. Now, before we wrap up the session, I just wanted to quickly mention different types of feedback loops that can emerge within your game without you necessarily noticing. And first of all, we have to consider that there are feedback loops that emerge outside of our game, for example, in the minds of our players. Think about a competitive board game, for example, where only one player wins, but over the course of the game you can trade resources with other players. What naturally happens in those kinds of games is that when one of the players is doing very well, accumulating all of the resources, the other players grow suspicious of them and stop trading with them. And they will be much more open to the idea of trading with a player who they think is not doing that well, when it looks like it's not very likely that they are going to win the round. Or think about how you're focusing enemies in MOBAs such as League of Legends. In League of Legends, where 5 players compete in a team against 5 other players, as one of the players on a team gets more and more kills, they have more money, they get more powerful items, and they become more of a threat to the enemy team. What usually happens then is that the enemy team tries to focus them, so they save their abilities with the most impact for that particular player and then use it all on them to eliminate them quickly. Those two mechanisms, the trading in board games and the focus in MOBAs, actually create a similar feedback loop. So one of the players is doing very well, which raises the awareness of other players that this person is doing well. And because of the awareness of other players, they can do things like, for example, they stop to trade with that player, which makes it harder for the player to keep doing well. So it complicates that. And we can see that this is some sort of negative feedback loop, and it emerges during the play of our game, even though we never designed this particular loop. So since this is clearly a feedback loop, but is not part of our game systems, I suppose we can think of them as external feedback loops. And once you've noticed external feedback loops like this, you could, for example, add mechanisms that play into that. In League of Legends, there is a bounty system. If you kill a player who's been doing very well, who gained a lot of kills or a lot of gold, you gain additional money, which of course raises the awareness of the enemy team even more, makes it even more desirable to eliminate that player. Also, we should be aware that some rules create the same balancing or reinforcing effects like feedback loops. Think about a board game like Sorry, where you draw a random card and on that random card there's a number that tells you how many tiles you can move. And to win this game, you have to land on an exact spot, in this case the home of your color. What that naturally creates is that as one of the players is approaching their goal, their home, this shrinks their possibility space, so less actions are viable. Whereas before it didn't really matter how many tiles we could move, suddenly we're looking for a specific number to finish the game. And that shrinking possibility space obviously impedes the player approaching their goal and gives other players the chance to catch up. So as we can see here, a single rule, the rule that you have to land on an exact spot to finish the game, creates an effect that is very similar to a negative feedback loop. Even though there is no feedback loop with all the different elements like a measuring function, a controller, and a game mechanical bias. So a rule that doesn't match the definition of a cybernetic feedback loop creates similar balancing or reinforcing effects, and we could think of them as pseudo-cybernetic feedback mechanisms. The constituent elements of a feedback loop are missing, but the effects are similar, and as designers we're often more interested in the actual effects on our players than whether or not something matches an exact definition. And lastly, it happens sometimes that feedback loops are part of our game systems, but they were created without intention. Let's make this clear with an example. In a lot of first-person shooter games you will see the following thing. The player takes damage, they're getting hit by an enemy, which then activates some sort of screen effect, either directly when they're hit or when they drop to a certain amount of health points. Either the screen becomes blurred or there are blood splatters all over the screen, and those screen effects obscuring the side actually make it harder to detect the enemies in the level. When it's harder to detect the enemies, it is more difficult to eliminate them and makes it more likely that we receive additional damage. We can see already that this forms some kind of death spiral that you know by now is an example of a positive destructive feedback loop, and this was probably never intended to be a feedback loop. Instead, those screen effects were probably added to clearly communicate to the player that something dangerous is happening, but by doing so the designers unintentionally created this positive feedback loop. Because of the lack of intention here, I would say we can think of those as accidental feedback loops. And it's very important that we identify them in the games that we create ourselves. For example, if we notice in our game during playtesting that fights become too difficult once the player takes the first hit because of those screen effects, we could quickly turn this positive feedback loop into a negative feedback loop. For example, we could just change the screen effect so that as your health points decrease, we put a monochromatic filter on the environment that renders everything in shades of gray except for the enemies that are highlighted in red. If you have a screen effect like this, it would not complicate the enemy detection, but make it easier when you're missing health points, and then less likely that you take additional damage. Or think about a game where instead of activating screen effect, we slow down time when the player is close to a death scenario. That would also then make it easier to see the enemies, watch their bullets, dodge them, and defeat the enemies. Alright, that's actually everything I wanted to share with you about feedback loops today. So when you're creating games, look out for accidental feedback loops that are part of your systems but that were created without intention. Look out for pseudo-cybernetic feedback mechanisms, so simple rules that create the same reinforcing or balancing effects. And observe your playtests closely to see if there are any external feedback loops that come up in the minds of the players during play. Obviously, feedback loops are so universal that there is much more to learn about this topic, so I want to recommend to you some resources that helped me a lot during the research for this topic. First of all, there is the Game Design Classic, Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals by Salin and Zimmerman. And in this book, there is a whole chapter dedicated to games as cybernetic systems. And this is a good introduction into the basics of a cybernetic feedback loop and also gives you more information about the structure of a feedback loop both in cybernetics and in games. Then there was a nice appendix that I found that was actually an appendix to a book about economics. This appendix is called Important Concepts in Systems and Cybernetics. You can find it at the link I provided on the slide, but the link will also be in the video description, as well as a download link for the slides of this presentation. And this text goes more into depth about what a cybernetic system is, and I particularly like the focus on the danger of both types of feedback loops and how to combine positive and negative feedback loops. If you understood the basic principle but maybe still struggle to see feedback loops in actual games, or if you need further guidance on fixing a feedback loop that has gone out of control, there is a great video by Game Maker's Tooltip called How Games Use Feedback Loops. And here Mark Brown takes Pyre as an example of good use of feedback loops, but he also uses other games to highlight the effects that feedback loops can create and even gives some bad examples of feedback loops that have ruined certain games and that had to be fixed later on. And lastly, another book on system design called Advanced Game Design, a System Approach, that actually has 2 different chapters that deal a lot with feedback loops. What is interesting here is that there's first of all a focus on visualizing the specific effects a feedback loop has. So the author created graphs of what a feedback loop would do if one was added to basketball, for example. And also in the later chapter, there's a lot about using feedback loops to improve game economies. So that's a very specific sub-aspect of system design that this book could help you with. Alright, that's everything for this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions about the topic or want to leave feedback about this talk, please let me know in the comments. Thank you very much and bye bye.